Thank you, Venerable Wushin. Thank you to all those who contributed so far this morning, Councillor Jeff McDonald and Kin, to our opening proceedings. One of the great joys this year has been working as a member of the Toowoomba Interfaith Working Group. It's a fairly new group established. We began meeting towards the end of about this time last year, but this year we've certainly been meeting on a regular basis. One of the aims of the group has been to, or one of the works of the group has been to create a common prayer, and a common prayer for world peace at that. We've had many great discussions on this particular prayer, and so I invite the members of the Toowoomba Interfaith Working Group to come up here on stage and to pray together the prayer. And this prayer will be prayed each morning for the duration of the conference. So would the members of the working group please come forward to read the prayer together.
So let's centre, take a slow breath and be thankful. Together we come.
From different parts of the world, with rich experience, and meet us from many lands, from many ideas, and diverse, and yet we stand united.
Our purpose is collective, our goals are common, our intention is harmony, and for this we give thanks.
Together we pray
For the well-being of creation,
for greater unity between people,
for guidance
and blessing,
and that goodness and peace may come.
Thank you.
Would you please thank the members of the Toowoomba Interfaith Working Group. We come now to the first keynote address of our conference, and that will be given by Bishop Cameron Venables, Anglican Bishop of the Western Region, Anglican Church Southern Queensland, and Chair of the Toowoomba Interfaith Working Group. Bishop Cameron was born in Northern Ireland in 1965 and grew up in London. And after tertiary study, he served in Papua New Guinea for 4 years as a volunteer teacher with the Society of St Francis. During this time in Papua New Guinea, he felt called to ordain ministry and was accepted to study and discern this further at St Francis Theological College in Brisbane, and before he was ordained a deacon and then subsequently a priest. After ordination, Bishop Cameron served in a team ministry based in the parish of Christchurch, Bundaberg, and he was also the foundation chaplain of St Luke's Anglican School. And then he returned to Papua New Guinea to serve as the diocesan youth coordinator in Popondota diocese, with a primary focus on HIV/AIDS community education and pastoral care. Bishop Cameron then returned to Australia in the year 2000 as an associate priest in a ministry team based at St Andrew's Anglican Church at Lismore, and he was also Anglican chaplain to the Southern Cross University. Then he headed north to central Queensland to become ministry coordinator and rector of the All Saints community in North Rockhampton, and he served in that role from 2004 to 2014. During that time he was also chaplain to the Rockhampton Grammar School. Bishop Cameron has a passion for many forms of mission, social justice and the creative arts. He is deeply thankful to God for the call to work with gifted, ordained and lay leadership throughout the Western region, and for the many signs of growth and vitality in parishes and schools. Bishop Cameron has been bishop now for 3 years? 2.5. What's 6 months among friends? Bishop Cameron's married to Kate and they have 3 children, and Bishop Cameron has made a great contribution not only to the ministry of the Christian faith here in Toowoomba in the Darling Downs, but also to the interfaith journey which all of us here in Toowoomba are currently engaged in. Would you please welcome Bishop Cameron to the microphone as he addresses us on living together in this global village, the future and the challenges.
Thank you to Richard. I've just had a sense of my life flashing before me. I give thanks for this opportunity to meet and speak on land that was first cared for by the Jaraway and Gaiba people. I acknowledge their elders past and present and ask God's blessing on each of these communities, particularly those individuals in them who are the custodians of language and law. I'm grateful to Master Chinkung and the Pure Land Learning and College Association for their sponsorship of this conference and for their ongoing commitment to peace and harmony in this community and in many parts of the world. A warm welcome to friends from Singapore and the US and to those who've come from Wales. Welcome to this garden city of Toowoomba. Please know you have friends here. It's fantastic to see friends from different parts of the Muslim community in Australia and Muslim representatives from other countries. I particularly acknowledge Professor Muhammad Abdullah from the University of South Australia and Salim Kidwai from the Muslim Council of Wales. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to you. I think there has never been a more important time for faith leaders and faith communities to be in dialogue with each other. May God bless and guide our journey together. We've come together from different parts of the world and from different communities in Australia. We speak different languages, we belong to different faith communities, and yet we have come together. Hopefully we each come with the expectation that in this space and in the holy ground of the conversations we share, we will find something. I wonder what your expectations include. I hope they include the expectation that you will learn something new about another person, perhaps about another community, perhaps about the contribution you can make to harmony and peace in your community. I hope you come with the expectation that you will meet and make at least one new friend, someone that you connect with and will see again. I hope that you come with the expectation that you will leave our time here encouraged. It's easy to feel discouraged when hearing about hospitals being destroyed in Aleppo, or conservative politicians denouncing an entire ethnic group because young people have been radicalised. In the conversation spaces created by this conference, may we listen deeply and well. May we recognise more clearly our shared humanity and become more determined to work together in the journey that lies ahead. My story is similar to many of you, for it's taken me far from the place of my birth. I was born in Northern Ireland, just outside Belfast, in a small community called Bangor. When I was 4 years old, my parents decided to leave Northern Ireland because of escalating conflict between Catholic and Protestant communities. Sadly, that violence followed us to England and continued for the next 30 years. It's worth remembering that in the 1970s there were 23 bombings, in the 1980s there were 7 bombings, in the 1990s there were 29 bombings, and between 2000 and 2001 there were 7 bombings. In this 30-year period there were 66 bombing attacks in England from militant Irish groups, variously named the Irish National Liberation Army, the official Irish Republican Army, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, and the Real Irish Republican Army. Given our love of acronyms, it probably sounds more familiar when I say the INLA, the official IRA, the Provisional IRA, and the Real IRA. I take the time to name this because it highlights the fact that terrorist attacks on English communities have been a tragic reality since 1971. They are not new. The inference given sometimes that it was a green and pleasant land until the experience of Islamist terrorism is very misleading. Over the last 11 years, there have been 9 Islamist attacks on English communities, and the first 4 of these were the bombings in London on July the 7th, 2005. After leaving Ireland, my family eventually settled in a suburb of Greater London. We lived in a semi-detached house, which Australians call a duplex. It means that 2 families share one building, and the wall that divides them is the one through which you gain insight into the life of the other. Our neighbours on the other side of that wall I called Auntie Irene and Uncle Ron. We were not related biologically, but there was a sense of extended family and respect. Auntie Irene was Estonian and had endured the trauma of watching her first husband being shot in front of her by Nazi soldiers during the Second World War. Because of this experience, Auntie Irene had no time for German people. Our neighbour on the other side of our house was Auntie Ingrid, and Auntie Ingrid was German. It was not the English comedian John Cleese who coined the phrase, "Don't mention the war." We know that people move from one country to another because of conflict grounded in religious and political difference. People also move from one country to another because there are better opportunities for employment and education. History teaches us that it has been like this for millennia, and it results in ethnically diverse people finding themselves sharing the same street, the same school, the same supermarket, the same workplace, the same church, the same mosque, the same political party. I don't think this makes us a global village. I think it simply makes our communities culturally and linguistically diverse. An interesting aside when we think about current political debates regarding migration and human rights is that the Australian bicentennial census of 1988 revealed that Australia was then the second most culturally diverse country in the world. We were second only to Israel. When I was 21, I flew from England to work in Papua New Guinea, and over the years have lived in that beautiful country for 9.5 years. So when I hear the term village, I have in my mind an English experience of church, pub, village green and war memorial, sitting alongside the PNG village experience of church, chewing betel nut, working in the garden, washing in the river, chopping firewood and cooking on a fire. Very different physical settings, and yet some social similarities. In a village, everybody seems to be related to each other, and people have a good sense of what is going on in the lives of their neighbours. If they don't really know, they will make it up and share their theories with any who will listen. In villages, there can also be a range of hierarchies that are not immediately apparent to the uninitiated. These can be based on who you're related to, what you do, or how much money you have. If this small-scale, intensely lived experience of community is called village, how can we make sense of the term global village? For example, I know where Bhutan is on a map, but I've never been there. I do not have a relationship with anyone who lives in Bhutan. I don't even know how to say in the official language of Dzongkar, "How are you?" I readily acknowledge that we live on the same planet, but do we live in the same village? In 1964, the Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan suggested in his book Understanding Media that the communication technologies of that time formed an electronic nervous system which enabled people to see and hear what was happening in other parts of the world. He chose the phrase global village because through the radio and television, people could have a good sense of what was going on in the lives of those in other countries. And if they didn't really know, they could make it up and share their theories with any who would listen. McLuhan was not the first to reflect on the unifying potential that communication technologies have. In 1926, the Serbian-American electrical engineer Nicholas Tesla suggested in an interview, when wireless is perfectly applied, the whole Earth will be converted into a huge brain, which in fact it is, all things being particles of a real and rhythmic whole. We shall be able to communicate with one another instantly, irrespective of distance. Not only this, but through television and telephony, we shall see and hear one another as perfectly as though we were face to face, despite intervening distances of thousands of miles, and the instruments through which we shall be able to do this will be amazingly simple compared with our present telephone. A man will be able to carry one in his vest pocket. It was back in 1926. How delighted would Tesla and McLuhan be with the communication technologies we take for granted in our time? According to my children, the mobile phone I use is terribly out of date because it is an iPhone 4 rather than an iPhone 7. Yet through the antiquated technology of my phone, I can speak to people in real time and see their faces while they are speaking. I can email and text, take photos and videos, and make playlists of music to delight my heart. There are friends living in remote villages in PNG who now text me on their mobile phones, send digital photos, and are active on Facebook. The batteries of their phones are charged by solar panels. If I wanted to, I could research Bhutan with the help of Google, get in touch with people in Thimphu through websites and Facebook, book flights and accommodation online, and learn a dozen phrases in Dzongkha via YouTube before I got on the plane. A global village, indeed. The amount of information available to us from the comfort of our own homes or wherever we have a mobile device is extraordinary. We can see beautiful and inspiring things as they are happening, or soon after they've happened. A speech, a musical performance, the view of our planet from the International Space Station, or a lotus flower opening. We can also see terrible things as they are happening, or soon after they've happened. An earthquake in China, a famine in Somalia, a suicide bomber in Kabul, or a teenager grieving the destruction of his community. In 2012, I asked a friend called Mohammed in Rockhampton how he's going. He showed me 3 photos of his cousin in Quetta, taken over a 2-week period. Mohammed is an Afghani Hazara community leader who now calls Australia home, but keeps in touch with family and friends who fled the conflict in Afghanistan and now live in Pakistan. The first photo was of his cousin laughing at a wedding. The second was of a car riddled with bullet holes, and the third was a picture of his body in the morgue. In this global village, we see terrible things as they are happening, or soon after they've happened, and the impact of this can be overwhelming. We have an informed sense that the issues are complex. Who the real players are is not always evident. At one level, a particular conflict may appear to be based on religious or political difference, but when you dig a little deeper, there are usually powerful individuals, or governments, or corporations, who want to control something for strategic or economic gain. What McLuhan didn't acknowledge clearly enough in 1964 was the power that communication technology has to not only inform, but also shape public perception. An often unspoken truth is that whoever owns or controls different forms of media has significant influence and power. There can be a subtle bias so that one side of a story or an argument is heard more clearly than another, and there can be an obvious bias which suggests one point of view is completely wrong in ways that create and escalate conflict. I think that conflict between individuals, between communities and between countries is normal. So how we perceive that conflict, respond to that conflict, manage that conflict, resolve or escalate that conflict is really important. Do we run away or disengage? Do we respond with violence or do we dialogue and seek a peaceful way forward? Our news media is full of complex brokenness, and after prolonged exposure to graphic images, I think we can feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it, traumatised by the nature of it, and utterly powerless to do anything to change things. The Australian social commentator Hugh Mackay observed in his book Advance Australia Where that the documentaries and news programs which dominated primetime TV in the 90s were gradually replaced by home renovation programs in the first decade of this century. He suggests that Australians felt increasingly powerless to change the complex realities behind the bad news, so they disengaged and found a sense of power by focusing on what their house looked like and what grew in their backyard. He uncomfortably writes that the quest for the perfect bathroom tile can become so engrossing, so distracting and so all-consuming that larger questions like, does our government lie to us? Do we have enough to retire on? Should Australian troops be in Iraq? These larger questions can't get a look in. Since that book was published in 2007, we've had the rise of reality TV shows, talent shows like The Voice, and the phenomenon of MasterChef. These seem to support Mackay's thesis that we can be tempted to disengage from a complex reality we have no control over to things we can easily control, like what we have for dinner. The larger questions have also shifted over the last 9 years, and I think today would include: how can the Australian community as a whole work together to limit and prevent radicalisation? What can Australia do to ensure food and water security in the increasingly difficult conditions created by climate change? And how can Australia best unlock the unrealised potentials of a culturally and linguistically diverse society? One of the gifts that faith communities bring to a society is the belief that there is always hope, that no matter how bad things get, there is always potential for good, that there are always opportunities for greater justice, and through working collaboratively with others, a new reality can be created. Bearing this in mind, I suggest as a person of faith that there is in our global village extraordinary potential for mutual flourishing, at the same time as extraordinary potential for catastrophe. In discerning where we variously and together might be headed, it is important to learn from history, for in this we might identify what conditions led to a particular conflict and collectively seek to avoid those conditions existing again. When reflecting on history, we might also recognise where things have been done well in the past and seek to emulate and adapt these things for the contexts of our own time. Let's look together at one experience and see if it rings any bells, not your phone. The rise of the Nazi Party in Germany had its origin in the aftermath of the First World War. In that time, the Weimar Republic sought to honour the peace treaty of Versailles by paying the crippling reparations outlined in Clause 231. The value of those reparations in today's money was $442 billion US, and the final payment was made in September 2010. For the population of Germany in that post-war period, there was a sense of humiliation and economic hardship. There was anger about the humiliation and fear about the future because of the economic hardship. Adolf Hitler spoke into the social reality of anger and fear and gave it a focus. He suggested that the Jews were to blame for Germany's troubles and that the Jews were responsible for the evils of both communism and capitalism. The Nazi Party was formed. The Nazi Party was banned. The Nazi Party reformed. And in the Great Depression, after American banks withdrew their support, the German banks collapsed. Hitler became Chancellor in 1932. He instituted anti-Jewish laws in 1933 and then became President in 1934. The stage was set for World War II. Reflecting on that experience, we might ask, what countries in the world today are experiencing severe financial hardship? In those countries, is there fear about the future? And who is being blamed for their current reality? In the recent American election, there appears to have been a successful strategy of feeding anger and exploiting fear by blaming an ethnic minority, illegal Mexican workers, and a religious minority, the Muslim community. Similarly, in the British decision to leave the European Union, it seems, at least from a distance, that manipulating anger and fear played a key role in determining the result. Right-wing politicians around the world have been encouraged to pursue similar agendas in their own country, and Australia is no exception. We live, with respect to Chinese-speaking friends, in interesting times. There is another piece of history we might helpfully reflect upon, and at this stage I do not see it explicitly on the agendas of either national or international political discussion. The insight comes from an analysis of the genocides that occurred in Rwanda in 1994. In the course of 100 days, the current Rwandan government estimate that 1,174,000 people were killed. The United Nations estimate is more conservative at 800,000. Let's stick with the Rwandan government estimate. Approximately 70% of these were from the Tutsi minority and 30% from the Hutu majority. The American scientist Jared Diamond suggests in his book Collapse that the principal reason for the genocide was extraordinary pressure on agricultural land. He concludes that this small African country could not sustain its population, and that by killing 16% of its population in just 100 days, it has bought itself some time. Diamond's analysis of Rwanda is uncomfortable because he goes on to suggest that Rwanda is a case study for the world, that ultimately the population of our global village will become unsustainable, and it will need to be a catastrophic loss of human life somewhere in order for our species to continue. He forecasts significant conflict in the future over agricultural land and water, which may be disguised as conflict about religious belief or political ideology. However, it is not all doom and gloom. We can also find in history examples of human society using their intellect and industry to innovate and create new possibilities. The modern state of Israel provides a helpful example. Since Israel was established in 1948, huge areas of formerly unproductive land have been transformed into agricultural land through the kibbutz system. In the kibbutz there is strong commitment to social justice, communal ownership, and environmental transformation. The Jewish prophet Isaiah articulated a vision in which God would open the rivers on the bare heights and fountains in the midst of the valleys. God would make the wilderness a pool of water, the dry land springs of water. God would put in the wilderness the cedar, the acacia, the myrtle and the olive. God would set in the desert the cypress, the plane and the pine tree together, so all may see, all may consider and understand. If this can happen in Israel, why not in other countries of the world? I think particularly of Australia, because so much of our landmass is desert. Of course, food scientists have done and continue to do extraordinary work to create plants and produce 2 or 3 crops a year, and to do this in a sustainable way. But this is not a conference about agriculture and food security. That said, I wonder if a shared understanding between faith leaders and scholars about our place in the natural world would be a valuable area to explore. Could we find common ground and agree we are called by God to care for it, and called by God to care for each other? Wise leadership seems to be vital in determining which potential is realised, global flourishing or global catastrophe. Wise and courageous leadership can do what many believe to be impossible. Think of Nelson Mandela's leadership in South Africa after he was elected president in 1994, or Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost in the late 1980s. But leaders are not able to do things alone. The vision needs to be owned and shared in order for a society to be transformed. When Barack Obama was first elected president of the United States, he had a vision that politics could be done differently, both within the US and between nations. So many of the things he hoped to achieve collaboratively were thwarted, and it would seem that some of his achievements will be dismantled with a new incumbent. It is not enough to just have wise and courageous leaders, although they have such an important role to play. I think the world needs wise and courageous communities, led by wise and courageous leaders, to make real the potential future in which all can flourish. I think the religions of the world have a key role to play in this, because at their best, they are focused on peace and justice for all. When they are at their best, there is love for the stranger, and people treat each other the way that they want to be treated. When they are at their best, they affirm that greed and idolatry are ultimately destructive, both for individuals, for communities, and for society. Part of the challenge for religions in our time is to each become the best version of ourselves we can be. I think this often means going back to the original teaching of our faith, to the sacred writing, to what we consider and recognise to be wise and good. The challenge is not only for religious leaders, but for all who belong to a community of faith. We need to pray, we need to study, and we need to live what we say we believe. As well as being familiar with the unique wisdom and story of our own faith community, I think we become peacemakers when we choose to find out more about the wisdom and story of those who belong to different faith communities. So when a church bell rings, or a muezzin calls from a minaret, or a bowl resonates in a temple, we recognise a call to prayer and can encourage this because prayer moves us away from idolatry and sustains us. When Muhammad chooses to fast during Ramadan, or Yaqub chooses to fast at Yom Kippur, or Susan chooses to fast during Lent, we recognise a desire for holiness and simplicity and can encourage this because fasting moves us away from greed towards simplicity and thankfulness. In our global village, may we seek to understand one another, learn from each other and be friends. In our global village, can we work together to create economic systems in which there is greater justice and political systems in which there is more compassion? In our global village, can we empower the creative potential of all people through education so that a much greater collective wisdom is available to us when responding to complex global challenge? I think the answer to each of these questions is yes. And the way they can each be achieved is through us, working together with others across this global village, because this is how vision becomes real, potential becomes reality, and hope becomes justified. May God bless and guide us in the journey. Namaste. In the time remaining for this session, I have 3 areas for us to reflect upon. The first individually, and the next 2 in pairs. I'd like to invite you to think of one friend from a faith community different to your own and be thankful for them. Just to bring them to your mind, cherish them and be thankful for them. If it's right to your tradition, even to ask a blessing on them and their family wherever they are at this time. So just take a few seconds to do that. I ask that we do this because sometimes we take each other for granted. We take friends from our own traditions and friends from other communities for granted, and in being more thankful and recognising the gift of that relationship, there's something positive there. I've got 2 questions I'd like us to consider. And the first is this: what are 2 issues in our world that grieve you most at this time? I invite you maybe to just have a bit of a think if something immediately comes to your mind. Because what I'd like us to do is to think about this question and the next question, and then in pairs to share with one another for about 10 minutes. What are 2 issues in our world that grieve you the most at this time, and how are you engaged in addressing them? I thought I'd start with something easy. And the next question I'd like us to reflect upon in the pairs is, what do you think needs to happen for your faith community to become its best self? If you can just split up into pairs around the tables, please, and take 10 minutes, and then I'll gather you together.
Would you please thank Bishop Cameron for a very thoughtful and, should I say, Bishop, a very wise address as well to begin our deliberations as we consider the theme of forging a common humanity through religious education and interfaith dialogue. You talked about in your address not taking our friends for granted, and I know I just shared with you this thought earlier. I think it's also worth reminding ourselves that we don't take our own particular tradition, faith tradition, for granted. Sometimes that's an easy thing to do because we're part of it all the time, and we certainly feel that we know it just as much as we know our own skin and mind. So it's well worth considering that, not taking each other for granted, that we take our own selves and our faith tradition for granted. also. We are going to have a bit of morning tea in a minute, and after we come back, we have an address by Inspector Steve Angus on social diversity, social harmony, reality and challenges. And that will be followed by a 10-minute video address from the Venerable Master Chin Kung. And what that will consist of is the launch of this little book, Words of Faith 360. I just pinched one from the table, and I promised Mei Ling I'll put it back. But this one happens to be the Australian Aboriginal Spirituality book. But there are books for each of the traditions, and I think everyone has received a book appropriate to their tradition as they've entered this morning. But after the 10-minute video from address from the Venerable Master, I'm going to invite the members of the Toowoomba Interfaith Working Group to come at the front bearing the book that they have as a sort of way of launching it. And then, because a photograph will be taken at that point, and then once that's finished, everyone will be invited for the full group photo. So just keep in mind, we'll all be asked to gather and have a group photo before we move to lunch. So let's have some morning tea and a good time to network, good time to get to know people. And if we come back here at about 11 o'clock. Thank you.